February 28, 2026. Just before dawn in the Middle East. American and Israeli fighter jets cross into Iranian airspace, carrying weapons that Oppenheimer once described as capable of ending civilization. Within hours, Iran's supreme leader is dead. Nuclear facilities are burning, and the world is watching the exact nightmare scenario that haunted Oppenheimer until his final days playing out in real time. This isn't speculation anymore. This isn't some distant possibility. This is happening right now. And if you understand what Oppenheimer actually predicted about nuclear weapons spreading across unstable regions, what you're watching unfold in the Middle East should terrify you way more than you probably realize. And if this kind of stuff makes you want to understand what's really happening under the surface of world events, hit subscribe, because what I'm about to show you connects physics, discovered 80 years ago, to headlines you're seeing today, in ways that are going to make you see this whole situation differently. Here's what most people miss when they watch news about strikes on Iran's nuclear program. They think this is just about preventing one country from getting the bomb. But Oppenheimer saw something way deeper, something that makes this whole situation infinitely more dangerous than politicians want you to believe. Back in 1946, just 1 year after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Oppenheimer testified before Congress and said something that basically predicted exactly what we're seeing right now. He said that nuclear weapons technology cannot be controlled by keeping it secret because the physics itself is not secret. The laws of nature are available to everyone, and any nation with enough resources and determination will eventually figure it out. He called it the inevitable spread of nuclear capability, and he warned that once that spread began, it would accelerate in exactly the kind of unstable regions where the consequences would be most catastrophic. Look at what just happened. The United States deployed 2 aircraft carrier strike groups to the region, the largest naval presence since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. They sent F-22 fighters to Israel for the first time ever. They positioned destroyers in the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean. All of this firepower aimed at preventing Iran from achieving what Oppenheimer said was inevitable. And here's the thing that should scare you. Iran responded by launching missiles and drones at American bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, Qatar. Hezbollah in Lebanon launched attacks on Israel. The conflict spread across multiple countries in a matter of days. This is precisely the cascading regional catastrophe that Oppenheimer warned about when nations compete for nuclear capability in areas where alliances are fragile and conflicts are already burning. Now, here's the paradox that Oppenheimer understood, and that makes this whole situation so impossible to solve. Nuclear weapons are based on physics, and physics is universal. You can't uninvent the knowledge. You can't make the laws of nature classified. When Oppenheimer and his team at Los Alamos figured out how to build an atomic bomb, they didn't just create a weapon. They proved that it was possible. And once you prove something is possible in physics, everyone knows it can be done. Think about what that means. In 1939, when Oppenheimer started working on nuclear chain reactions, most scientists weren't even sure if an atomic bomb could actually work. There were huge theoretical questions about whether you could sustain a chain reaction, whether you could compress uranium or plutonium fast enough, whether the whole thing would just fizzle out. But on July 16, 1945, at 5:29 in the morning in the New Mexico desert, the Trinity test proved it worked. A ball of fire hotter than the surface of the sun. A mushroom cloud rising 40,000 feet into the sky. 20 kilotons of explosive force from a sphere of plutonium the size of a softball. And in that moment, Oppenheimer said later, "We knew the world would not be the same." But here's what he also knew and what haunted him for the rest of his life. That demonstration meant every other nation now knew it was possible, and knowing it's possible is 90% of the battle in physics. The Soviet Union tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, just 4 years after Trinity. China got the bomb in 1964. India in 1974. Pakistan in 1998. North Korea in 2006. Each time the interval got shorter because the fundamental physics was already proven. You can't unprove it. You can't make nations forget that E equals mc squared. You can't erase the knowledge that if you can enrich uranium to 90% purity, or compress plutonium with precisely timed explosive lenses, you get a nuclear explosion. That knowledge is out there forever. And this is where the paradox gets really disturbing. The very act of trying to prevent nuclear proliferation by striking nuclear facilities proves that those facilities were real, were getting close, were dangerous enough to warrant a military response. Iran's been working on nuclear technology for decades. The international community has known about facilities at Natanz, Fordo, Isfahan. There have been sanctions, agreements, inspections, sabotage operations. Israel struck Iranian nuclear sites in June of 2025. And now, in February 2026, the United States and Israel just conducted what they're calling Operation Epic Fury, with the specific goal of dismantling Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities. But here's what Oppenheimer would tell you about that strategy. Every strike that damages Iran's program also proves how far they got. Every destroyed centrifuge confirms they were enriching uranium. Every bombed research facility validates that serious weapons development was happening. And every neighboring country watching this thinks the same thing. If Iran got that close despite sanctions and strikes and international pressure, maybe we need our own deterrent. Saudi Arabia, watching Iran get repeatedly bombed, just signed a mutual defense agreement with Pakistan in September 2025. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Turkey's been making noises about nuclear capability for years. Egypt has never officially pursued the bomb, but has the technical capability. The United Arab Emirates has civilian nuclear reactors. Once the regional nuclear competition begins, Oppenheimer warned, it becomes a race where every nation's security depends on matching their rivals, and the whole system spirals toward inevitable catastrophe. Picture what Oppenheimer saw in his mind when he thought about this scenario. Imagine you're standing in Los Alamos in 1945, and you've just proven that humans can release the binding energy of atomic nuclei as a weapon. You understand the physics completely. You know that uranium-235, when you fire a neutron at it, splits into smaller atoms and releases more neutrons. Those neutrons hit more uranium atoms. More splits. More neutrons. Chain reaction. Exponential growth. One split becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes millions in microseconds. And the energy, Oppenheimer calculated the numbers himself. Every single atom of uranium that splits releases about 200 million electron volts of energy. That doesn't sound like much until you realize there are roughly 2.5 times 10 to the 24th atoms in just 1 pound of uranium. When you do the math, and Oppenheimer absolutely did the math, 1 pound of fully fissioned uranium releases the same energy as roughly 8,000 tons of TNT. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima, called Little Boy, used about 140 pounds of uranium, but only about 2 pounds actually fissioned. 2 pounds. And it killed between 70,000 and 140,000 people, destroyed 5 square miles of city, and left radiation effects that lasted for generations. Now imagine what Oppenheimer was thinking. He knew this wasn't magic. It was physics. Reproducible, understandable, inevitable physics. Any nation with uranium deposits, which are found on every continent, and the industrial capacity to enrich that uranium, which requires centrifuges and precision engineering, but nothing beyond mid-20th century technology, could build this weapon. He knew it would spread. Here's a thought experiment to help you feel what Oppenheimer felt. Imagine you've discovered a new kind of fire. A fire that doesn't need fuel, doesn't need oxygen, can't be put out by water. A fire that once started burns with the heat of the sun. And you've just demonstrated this fire by using it to incinerate an entire city. Now imagine you're trying to convince other people never to make this fire, even though you just showed them exactly how powerful it is, and they can see the basic principles are just chemistry and physics they already understand. That's the trap Oppenheimer found himself in. The demonstration of power that ended World War II simultaneously guaranteed that power would spread to other nations. He testified in front of Congress. He spoke at the United Nations. He warned everyone who would listen. In one particularly haunting statement from 1946, he said, "There is no secret, and there is no defense. No secret because the physics is published in every textbook. No defense because once these weapons exist, no wall is high enough, no distance is far enough, no shield is strong enough." And he was right. By the 1960s, both the United States and Soviet Union had enough nuclear weapons to destroy human civilization multiple times over. The doctrine became mutually assured destruction. If you launch, we launch, everyone dies, so nobody launches. That worked, barely, for two superpowers who had direct communication channels and shared an interest in not ending the world. But what happens when you have 8, 9, 10 nuclear powers? What happens when some of those powers are regional rivals with active conflicts? What happens when the nations involved have religious or ideological reasons to see their enemies destroyed? Oppenheimer knew this scenario was coming. He wrote about it. He warned about it. He called it the Proliferation nightmare. Not one or two responsible powers with world-ending arsenals, but dozens of nations with smaller arsenals pointed at their neighbors. And this is where Oppenheimer's specific revelation becomes absolutely critical to understanding what's happening right now in the Middle East. Before I get to the most disturbing part, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I'm always curious where in the world people are who want to understand this stuff, because what I'm about to explain connects your safety directly to decisions being made thousands of miles away. Oppenheimer didn't just worry about nuclear weapons spreading in general terms. He specifically identified the conditions that would make regional nuclear proliferation catastrophic. First, neighboring countries with deep historical conflicts. Second, limited geographic space where weapons could reach targets in minutes. Third, religious or ideological motivations that might override rational deterrence. Fourth, the involvement of non-state actors who can't be deterred by traditional means. And fifth, the presence of global powers with conflicting interests who might get drawn into regional conflicts. Look at the Middle East right now through that lens. Iran and Israel have been rivals for decades. Iran supports Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, militias in Iraq and Syria. Israel has conducted hundreds of strikes against Iranian assets across the region. The distance from Tehran to Tel Aviv is less than 1,000 miles. Missiles can cover that distance in under 10 minutes. There's barely any warning time. The ideological component is intense. Iran's government has explicitly called for Israel's destruction. Israel sees a nuclear Iran as an existential threat. And now you've got the United States, which backs Israel, conducting joint strikes with the stated goal of regime change. Russia has a military pact with Iran. China's calling for de-escalation while condemning the strikes. The global powers are taking sides. This is every single condition Oppenheimer identified as the path to catastrophe. And here's what makes it even worse. The actual weapons and delivery systems have gotten way more sophisticated since Oppenheimer's time. When he was calculating yield and fallout patterns in the 1940s, the bombs were massive, required huge bombers to deliver, and could be detected and potentially intercepted. Modern nuclear weapons can fit on missiles the size of telephone poles. Iran, according to U.S. intelligence reports, has been developing ballistic missiles capable of reaching targets across the Middle East and potentially as far as southern Europe. Some of these missiles are mobile, launched from trucks that can relocate constantly. You can't bomb all the trucks. You can't track all the mobile launchers. And if Iran doesn't have nuclear warheads yet, and that's a big if because reports suggest they got pretty far before the strikes, they could still provide missile technology to proxy groups who would absolutely use them. Oppenheimer foresaw this exact problem. In 1953, after the first hydrogen bomb test proved you could make weapons 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima, he gave a speech where he said the weapons are becoming smaller, more efficient, easier to deliver, and the knowledge of how to make them is spreading to more and more nations. He said we are building a world where dozens of fingers are on dozens of triggers, and any regional conflict could spiral into nuclear exchange. The Middle East in 2026 is that world made real. What happened on February 28th wasn't just a military operation. It was a test of whether the old model of preventing proliferation through force still works. Israel and the U.S. tried this approach before. They bombed Iraq's Osirak reactor in 1981. They hit Syrian facilities in 2007. They've conducted cyber attacks and assassinations and sabotage operations against Iran's program for years. They hit Iranian sites again in June 2025. And now, in February 2026, they launched what's being described as one of the largest coordinated strikes since the invasion of Iraq. They killed Iran's supreme leader. They damaged nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan. They targeted missile production sites, command centers, leadership. And Iran immediately responded with missiles and drones targeting U.S. bases across the Gulf. The conflict expanded to Lebanon, to Iraq, to multiple countries within days. Shipping routes are threatened. Oil prices are spiking. Global powers are choosing sides. Every neighboring country is calculating whether they need their own deterrent. This is the cascade Oppenheimer warned about. This is what he meant when he said the physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose. The sin wasn't building the first bombs, the sin was proving it could be done, and then watching helplessly as that knowledge spread to regions where the consequences of use are almost certain. Now connect this to your own existence, to your own safety, to the world you're living in right now. This isn't abstract physics happening in some distant desert. This is real. Actual nuclear facilities burning, actual missiles being launched, actual regional war expanding in real time. And the physics that makes it all possible, the physics Oppenheimer helped discover and perfect, is still the same physics that governs everything around you. Every atom in your body contains a nucleus held together by forces so powerful that if you could release even a tiny fraction of that energy, you'd have a bomb. Oppenheimer understood this at the deepest level. He knew that matter is just concentrated energy. That E equals mc squared isn't some abstract equation. It's a literal description of reality. The mass of an atomic nucleus, any nucleus, yours, mine, the chair you're sitting on, is slightly less than the sum of its parts. That missing mass, called the mass defect, is the binding energy that holds the nucleus together. And if you can overcome that binding force, if you can split a heavy nucleus or fuse light ones, that binding energy gets released as heat, light, radiation, and blast. The amount of energy is staggering. 1 gram of matter, if you could convert it completely to energy, would equal the explosion of about 21,000 tons of TNT. That's 21 kilotons. That's roughly the size of the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki. 1 gram, the weight of a paperclip, inside every atom of your body. And here's what got to Oppenheimer. What haunted him. You're made of roughly 7 times 10 to the 27th atoms. That's 7 billion atoms. Each one is a tiny reservoir of bound energy. If you could somehow release all of it, which you can't, but if you could, the energy contained in a single human body would be equivalent to about 900 megatons of TNT. That's roughly 18,000 Hiroshima bombs. That's how much energy is locked inside the ordinary matter that makes up you. And nuclear weapons are just the technology that figured out how to release a tiny, tiny fraction of that energy in a few specific types of atoms. Oppenheimer saw this. He saw that we're living in a universe where incomprehensible amounts of energy are all around us, inside us, hidden in the atomic structure of everything. And once you know how to access that energy, once you prove it can be weaponized, you can never go back to pretending it's not there. The knowledge changes everything. Right now, as you're reading this, there are probably a dozen nations with the technical capability to build nuclear weapons if they decide to. There are dozens more who could get there with a few years of focused effort. The physics is known, the engineering is documented, the materials, while controlled, can be obtained or produced. And every time there's a regional conflict where one side feels existentially threatened, the calculation shifts toward pursuing nuclear capability as the ultimate guarantee of survival. This is what Oppenheimer meant when he said we knew the world would not be the same. He didn't just mean the world changed on July 16, 1945, when Trinity succeeded. He meant that the human species entered a fundamentally new and more dangerous phase of existence. We became capable of our own extinction. We proved we could build weapons that release energies previously only seen in stars. And we distributed that knowledge across the planet through scientific publications, espionage, and the basic fact that physics works the same way everywhere. The Middle East situation right now is that danger made manifest. Iran rebuilt its program after previous strikes. They got close enough to nuclear capability that Israel and the U.S. felt compelled to launch a massive attack. Iran responded by attacking American bases and firing missiles across the region. Neighboring countries are wondering if they need bombs of their own. The global powers are maneuvering for advantage. And the whole thing is happening in one of the most volatile regions on Earth, where the distance between capitals is measured in minutes of missile flight time, where religious and ideological conflicts run centuries deep, where proxy forces complicate every calculation. Oppenheimer saw this coming. He warned us. He told everyone who would listen that the bomb wouldn't stay secret, wouldn't stay limited to responsible powers, wouldn't remain a theoretical threat. He said it would spread to regions where the probability of use was highest, and he was absolutely, horrifyingly right. So here's where we are. Nuclear weapons technology is based on physics that can't be unlearned. The knowledge of how to build them has spread to at least 9 confirmed nuclear states, and probably several more who are close. The Middle East, one of the most unstable and conflict-prone regions on Earth, is now actively involved in a competition for nuclear capability, where multiple nations feel their survival depends on having the bomb. The traditional method of preventing proliferation, military strikes, just proved again that it doesn't permanently solve the problem and might actually accelerate the regional arms race. And the fundamental physics that makes all of this possible, the binding energy of atomic nuclei, the relationship between mass and energy, the mechanics of chain reactions, All of that is just nature. It's not good or evil. It's just true. Oppenheimer understood that truth more deeply than almost anyone. He helped prove that you could weaponize it. And then he spent the rest of his life trying to prevent what's happening right now in the Middle East. A regional nuclear crisis where the stakes are existential and the margin for error is measured in seconds. The strikes on February 28th killed Iran's supreme leader. They damaged nuclear facilities. They demonstrated American and Israeli military reach. But they didn't erase Iran's knowledge of how to build centrifuges or enrich uranium or design weapons. They didn't convince neighboring countries to abandon their own nuclear ambitions. They didn't solve the underlying problem that Oppenheimer identified 80 years ago. Once you prove that something is physically possible, you can't make it impossible again. Here's what nobody wants to say out loud. We might be watching the beginning of exactly the scenario that terrified Oppenheimer most. Not a single nuclear war between superpowers, which at least operated under some rational deterrence theory, but a cascading series of nuclear arms races in unstable regions where the weapons are seen as necessary for survival, and where the threshold for use is way, way lower. If Iran rebuilds, which history suggests they will, and gets the bomb, Saudi Arabia has already said they'll pursue nuclear capability. Turkey might follow. Egypt would face pressure to match. Israel already has an estimated 90 to 300 nuclear warheads, though they've never officially confirmed. Pakistan has nuclear weapons and could provide technology to allies. The whole region could go nuclear within a decade. And once that happens, once you have 8 or 9 nuclear-armed states in the Middle East, all with conflicting interests and active proxy wars and religious motivations and barely any geographic space, the probability of actual nuclear use goes from theoretical to inevitable given enough time. Oppenheimer knew this math. He ran the calculations. He understood that complex systems with multiple unstable components will eventually find their way to catastrophic failure. What would you do if you could see what Oppenheimer saw? If you understood at the level of physics that every nation has access to the same laws of nature, the same binding energy in atomic nuclei, the same potential to build weapons that can incinerate cities in microseconds? Can you look at what's happening in the Middle East right now and not see his warnings coming true? If the knowledge of nuclear weapons is impossible to contain, and the physics guarantees it will spread, what exactly is the end game here? If this completely changed how you see the strikes on Iran and what they actually mean for the future, smash that like button so I know this kind of deep analysis matters to people. And if you want to keep understanding the physics and history that explains where we're headed, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because I'm breaking down the real science behind world events every single week. Drop a comment telling me which aspect of Oppenheimer's warnings you want me to explore next. Thanks for watching.